This video is the life and ideas of Giuseppe Mazzini, who is key thinker number 3 for paper 3 optional ideologies, nationalism. Mazzini was born 1805 and died in 1872. He was a politician, revolutionary, socialist and Italian nationalist who dedicated his life to the unification of Italy. We'll talk very briefly about his socialism because there's a link to socialist key thinker number 1, Karl Marx. Mazzini opposed Marxism and liberalism. Liberalism mostly because he believed it to be a godless ideology and he himself was a believer in God. But he seemed to have an opposition to both Marxism and a personal opposition to Karl Marx. He didn't like Marxism's focus on social class and the idea that the working man has no nation, as was written in the Communist Manifesto. But Marx and Mazzini, although their ideas in some senses were similar, they personally did not get on. Marx once referred to Mazzini as an old ass, and Mazzini referred to Marx as a destructive spirit. So Mazzini advocates for social democracy, and he's a proponent of republican government. Let's talk about his revolutionary life. He was exiled to Genoa in 1831, and that was because he was the member of the Carbonari, which was a secret organisation that campaigned for the reunification or unification of Italy and reform of the Catholic Church. In 1831, he sets up La Giovane Italia, which is Young Italy, and that was with the intention of setting up a free, independent, republican nation. At the time, Italy was made up of several smaller states under the jurisdiction of different monarchs, but also, in some cases, the Catholic Church too. He wanted to bring all Italians together. And like key thinker number 2, von Herder, Mazzini has a focus on language as well as a shared culture and history. So in 1831, Young Italy was set up. By 1834, there was a Young Europe movement. So there was a similar movement in Germany, in Poland, later in Turkey. So what we're starting to see is Mazzini's idea spread throughout Europe. By 1833, Young Italy had 60,000 members. And that's when we see his first failed attempted revolution. 12 of those involved were executed. Mazzini, who was absent at the trial because he'd escaped, was sentenced to death in his absence. There was another attempted uprising in 1834 that failed. He was arrested. He was exiled from Switzerland to France, and then later was exiled from France to England. In 1843, he organises an uprising in Bologna. The leaders were arrested and executed, and it turns out that Mazzini, who was trying to organise this revolt from Britain, his letters had been intercepted by the British government, who had gone on to inform the relevant authorities. And that's when certainly a liberal opinion in Britain began to view this revolutionary with a certain degree of sympathy, because he was seen to be fighting against the powers of the state. In 1844, Rome had been declared a republic, and in the young government that was set up, Mazzini was declared one of the 3 leaders there. However, by July, he had to flee Rome to France when French troops entered under the instruction of the Pope. And there were failed riots and uprisings in 1852, 1853, 1854, 1856, 1862 and 1870. He died in 1872, and it's said that 100,000 people attended his funeral. So this is a man who truly dedicated his life to a revolutionary cause, which was to unify the Italian people. A couple of things I want to talk about. His key work was written in 1860, The Duties of Man, and there are many works of Mazzini's, and I'm going to try now just to very briefly summarise them. For Mazzini, patriotism was a duty and a love for what he called the fatherland, but he believed that to be a divine mission from God. He referred to the nation of Italy as the home wherein God has placed us. And when he talks about the nation, when he talks about what it means to be Italy, he talks about ties of common religion, history, and language. So there is some similar cultural ties to key thinker number 2, von Herder, in that sense. But actually his outlook is far more liberal. So his ideas are more linked to that of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. However, speaking of liberalism, he opposed the concept of natural rights. He didn't believe that this was something that man naturally enjoyed. He believed that an individual's rights were gained, and it was a duty that was won, and that was won through hard work, sacrifice, and virtue. And that can go a long way to explaining why Mazzini dedicated his life to the revolutionary cause, the hard work and sacrifice that he put in to achieve his ultimate goal. And one thing that we'll mention when we talk about society later on, in the duties of man, he called for equal rights for women too, and he considered equality as absolutely fundamental to the creation of a truly democratic nation. Okay, let's look at Mazzini and his views on human nature, state, society and economy. As I've alluded to in previous videos, when it comes to the nationalist key thinkers, there will be less of a focus on this than in your core ideologies, because you've not got the 9 markers, and the 9 markers will always be somewhat based around these 4 key concepts. But it is still helpful to see how these key thinkers viewed the 4 key concepts. And so, for human nature, human beings seek liberty. So again, there's that link. This is why we consider him a liberal nationalist. Human beings naturally seek liberty, but that liberty that we seek is collective, and we share a history and a cultural heritage with those with whom we make up the nation with. And so although we naturally seek liberty, we do it collectively, and we do it for a group of people with that shared cultural history and cultural identification. So there's some similarities to von Herder there. Now the state. You might have heard me refer to his socialism, and also that he was a Republican. So he believed in what he considered to be true democracy. And for that, it had to be a Republican state. There were to be no monarchs in Mazzini's vision for a future Italy. Rather, it would be a true democracy, a social democracy, where rights have been granted to citizens in order for that true democracy to flourish. And republicanism for him is the natural state that a free nation of people would choose. In his mind, if you allowed people to design the state to serve their interests best, they would choose a republican form of government. They would not choose to live under a monarch. Okay, next up is society. And for him, a free society produces a free individual. And again, we can see those links to liberalism there, this focus on the individual and individual liberty. But for him, society must be free in order for the individual to be free. And so for personal freedom to flourish, the right society has to be in place, and that is linked to the state. The right state needs to be in place. And when we talk about this idea that in the Italian nation that he looked forward to, that he tried to create, in that nation, both of the sexes would enjoy equal rights. So for his time, the mid-18th century, he was very much ahead of his time. One criticism of Marx is when you look through his work, it's almost solely focused on men, and his focus on exploitation was on a male-dominated industry. And so there's a lot of sort of feminist revision and interpretation of Marx's work later on. But Mazzini was very much focused on both of the sexes in his thinking. And then finally, when it comes to economics, again, a little bit like with Van Herder, there's not a lot to go off when we're thinking about the economy, or certainly when Mazzini is involved. Again, it links back to the state. The nation will create an appropriate state, which is a republican democracy which respects the rights of all, and that general freedom will provide economic freedom for individuals to flourish as they see fit. Okay, so what sort of nationalist is Mazzini? You will see him referred to as a liberal or a civic nationalist, similar to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, key thinker number one. I think there's also some links to Herder there as well, because for Mazzini, the Italian language was one thing that brought people together. And of course, Van Herder was focused on cultural ties. And for Mazzini, his nationalism and what it meant to be a part of the Italian nation was to basically create a nation for the descendants of ancient Rome. Now, this idea is going to be taken and manipulated by Benito Mussolini in the 20th century. But Mussolini's politics were very different to that of Mazzini. But one thing that Mussolini takes on board from Mazzini is this idea of the Italian people as the descendants of the greatness of ancient Rome. So let's look at the key letters that I've come up with for Mazzini. I've got 3 R's, FL and I. So the R's, revolutionary. He dedicated his life to popular uprisings against the systems of power that prevented the Italian people from unifying together. So he was a revolutionary, but he was also a republican. He rejected the rule of a monarch or rule by the Pope. Now, he wasn't sort of anti-religion, but he was certainly critical of the political power that the Catholic Church had. So he's a revolutionary and he's a republican. But then finally, romanticism. A lot of Mazzini's work is about his patriotism and his love for an Italy that doesn't yet exist, that he is determined in his lifetime to bring about. I've put FL because he's forward-looking. Yes, he wants to bring the descendants of ancient Rome together, but he is looking forward to a new Italy, to bringing the Italian people together. His nationalism focuses on what can and will be for the Italian people. And of course, he's despite the fact that he supports revolution as a means to overthrow the current systems of power, despite that, he focuses on creating a democracy, and that's part of his forward-looking approach. And then finally, he was an international nationalist, which sounds quite strange. He had an international viewpoint. So he didn't look solely at Italy. Remember, he was involved not just in the Young Italy movement, but the Young Europe movement. And for him, peace and cooperation between separate nations was absolutely vital to the preservation of each of those states. And so he didn't focus exclusively on Italy. That was his passion, that was his life's work. But he was very much an internationalist, that countries would self-determine their own borders, their own system of government, and they would work together for cooperation and peace. And that's an idea that is taken on by Woodrow Wilson after the First World War, when he tries to set up the League of Nations. So for Mazzini, yes, he focuses on Italy, and that is his dedicated life's work. But he also sees the importance of Italy cooperating peacefully with its neighbours for the good of Italy and for other countries.